gentlemen, veterans, all active duty personnel here, it's an honor to be here in your presence. I'd like to thank Colonel McMahon and Steve for that honor. But I'm not just here because of that invitation, nor because I wrote a book that Steve very ably introduced and told you a little bit about. I'm here because some extraordinary individuals successfully delivered a message. They told a story, if you will. And that story is one that you've heard a little bit about today, and that most of you, nearly all of you, should be somewhat familiar with your attendance here today. It began in the dark early days of World War II, when only the Philippines, though completely enveloped by a strangling blockade, refused to fall. After losing a majority of its air power in the war's early hours, in a chaotic retreat into the Bataan Peninsula, the one officer would call a small Dunkirk, approximately 100,000 Filipino and American troops held off a rampaging Imperial Japanese army for nearly 5 months on the strength of promised reinforcements and supplies en route from the United States. Buoyed by these reports of long relief convoys, they fought on with dogged determination, with obsolete weapons and war material. In some accounts, ammunition and medical supplies unpacked on Bataan were wrapped in newspapers with 1918 dates. The troops themselves were outfitted in the past, much like the gentlemen to my right are. M1917 A1 helmets, doughboy-style helmets, leggings. They fought on half rations in an information vacuum with nearly no news from the outside world. No letters from home, no care packages, no movies, no star-studded USO shows, no visits from Bob Hope or Betty Grable. This war was not one pictured on HBO's recent miniseries, The Pacific. These men fought on alone, together. If ever there was an army of irregulars, this was it. Constabulary police troops and Filipinos from Luzon, the Visayas and Mindanao, shoulder to shoulder with plainless American pilots and airmen, as well as shipless sailors and engineers in the dense Bataan jungle, were U.S. Marines and Navy Blue Jackets side by side with Filipino air cadets and civilians in the foxholes and trenches on Corregidor. There were anti-aircraft gunners, engineers, and tankers from National Guard units from small towns like right here in Maywood, alongside Igorots, Negritos, and other native tribesmen from tiny barrios throughout the Philippines. The dog faces of the all-American 31st Infantry fought right next to the Philippine Scouts, elite Filipino troops who served under American officers. The collective efforts of these men, ill-equipped, inexperienced, outgunned, and surrounded, was nothing short of extraordinary. That's the beginning of this incredible story. Despite the odds, they cobbled together an impossible series of victories at places most Americans have probably never heard of. Places that don't appear in school history texts. Layak Junction, the Points, the Pockets, Subic Bay. Together, they frustrated Japanese General Masaharu Hama and his Imperial Japanese 14th Army at every opportunity. But help would never come to the Philippines. Because of an Allied strategic mandate to defeat Nazi Germany first, they would have to be sacrificed to future victories. There are times, wrote Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson in his diary in 1942, when men must die. Despite the fact the Philippines were written off, the battling bastards of Bataan and the forces garrisoning Corregidor and the other islands of the vast archipelago thwarted Japanese plans to conquer the Pacific by selflessly sacrificing their blood to buy time for the Allied war effort to kick into high gear. Homa, few people other than most historians and military strategists know, have been given a 50-day deadline to conquer the Philippines. He missed that deadline, and it wasn't even close, by 99 days. As the Major had told us, probably saving Australia and New Zealand in the process. On April 9th and May 6, 1942, respectively, these gaunt, stubble-bearded troops, surrounded, starved, shell-shocked, and diseased, finally laid down their arms. But the fact that they had severely disrupted Japan's chronological timetable for conquest was not something that these men were aware of. The defeat of the Philippines was, and still is, the largest surrender in American military history. But the story I had mentioned earlier did not end there. In fact, it was only beginning. These gallant defenders were subjected to some of the most barbaric treatment ever afforded prisoners of war. The infamous Bataan Death March, a 60-mile forced evacuation of prisoners out of the Bataan Peninsula, saw an estimated 700 Americans, and potentially as many as 10,000 Filipinos killed by a variety of methods. Beheading, stabbing, rifle fire, being buried alive. Then there were the horrors of squalid prison camps, O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, Bilibid, Palawan, and Dapicol, among others. These individuals struggled to endure the unbearable. They were antique diseases, tortured by hunger as well as their captors. Men starved, beatings, executions, and other indescribable atrocities were commonplace. There was no concept of surrender in the Japanese code of conduct, so the Japanese despised any enemy who did. Such humiliation and mistreatment looked to be the norm, rather than the exception, as long as the prisoners were under Japanese control. But the story didn't end in these hellish prison camps. Even though no one in the United States or the rest of the world knew that it was taking place in these places, or this part of the story. In April 1943, a group of special heroes who were determined to alert the world to what was taking place in Japanese-occupied territories accomplished perhaps the most impossible mission of the entire war. They did something that no other mass group of prisoners the Japanese could during the war. They escaped. Under the noses of their captors, 8 ingenious and determined U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps officers, plus 2 Army enlisted men, plus 2 Filipino convicts, engineered the perfect escape plan from a place called the Davao Penal Colony, a vast, supposedly escape-proof prison plantation built by the Philippine government in 1932 to house violent criminals. Surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable swamp filled with Philippine crocodiles that reportedly grew to lengths of 10 feet, giant insects and walls of kogan grass, a tall plant with blades of thick grass grew between 6 and 12 feet in height, and even headhunters surrounded the area. Davao, or the Davao Penal Colony, was considered the Filipino Alcatraz or Devil's Island. On the heels of their victory in the Philippines in 1942, the Japanese assumed control of this penal colony and decided to put several thousand of their new American captives to work. Upon their arrival, the POWs were addressed by Major Kazuo Maeda, the Japanese commandant at Davao. He was unhappy with the skinny, weak prisoners lined up before him. He had asked for a group of healthy men to perform labor at the camp. There were no strong, healthy men in this group of POWs or elsewhere in the Philippines. Still, Maeda would not alter his orders. Davao would be a profitable enterprise for the Japanese army, even if it meant the prisoners would have to work to death. You are not here to lazy, he told them. You are here to learn about hard labor. Every prisoner will continue to work until he's actually hospitalized. Punishment for malingerers will be severe. Maeda remained true to his message. For several months, these prisoners worked away as slaves. They cleaned ditches in latrines, worked at a lumber mill, spent hours in rice paddies, planted fields, worked with ornery carabao, picked tons of bananas, coffee beans, and other fruits and vegetables. They did so while being starved and beaten. It wasn't until early 1943, however, the realistic escape plans could even be considered by the surrendered defenders of the Philippines. For months, they had withstood intense physical and mental abuse. Malnutrition and disease left many unable to walk, let alone escape, and evade a pursuing enemy. And mentally, the painful sting of battlefield defeat had only recently begun to subside. But for 10 of these men, the momentum began to change. Despite the inherent risks, certain torture, and likely death, which would result upon their recapture, there was no choice nor time to waste. Not just for them, but for all of their comrades around them. This story had to be told. I felt I was already dead, said Marine Lieutenant Jack Hawkins. I felt as though I was living on borrowed time. According to Lieutenant Sam Garaccio, fighter pilot of the 21st Pursuit Squadron, the risks of both the escapees and those remaining at Davao were risks that needed to be taken. We had made the considered judgment that the opportunity to let the whole world know what went on in Japanese camps would create sufficient pressure that conditions in such camps would be improved. This would justify whatever punishment might be inflicted. So the escape, they began to realize, was more than just an opportunity to save their own lives. It was an opportunity to help their friends from places like Maywood, Port Clinton, and elsewhere, and other Allied POWs scattered throughout Pacific Theater prison camps and elsewhere in the Far East. In an incredible story of their own, they accomplished this impossible mission. The first yet limited details of this incredible story of what had happened to America's heroes after the Stars and Stripes had been hauled down in the Philippines reached the American public in July of 1943. In a brief telegraphic dispatch to the nation's press, chronicled the recuperation of one Major William Edwin Dias, who was a Bataan air hero. When America's editors and reporters learned of Dias' experiences in Japanese prison camps, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic news breaks of the entire war. It was a struggle to publish Dias' stories. Dias, recovering from a physical breakdown in a hospital bed in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, narrowed the field of bidders to a major national weekly magazine and a publication familiar to everyone in this audience, the Chicago Tribune. The Tribune bought the rights to Dias' story for $21,000, at that time a small fortune, and won in 2010 dollars more than $250,000. The Tribune was not successful because of its monetary bid, said Dias. Money isn't important, he said. It's the story that matters, and it still does. Dias' consuming inception was to expose to the world Japan's barbaric treatment of its war prisoners and conquered peoples. That was his primary motivation. Having become acquainted with Japanese psychology during his 361 days in captivity, he firmly believed that shaming Japan in front of the international community was the only way to secure better treatment for Allied prisoners, and the only way to help educate and enrage the American public toward pushing for a greater effort in the Pacific. But America would not hear the story as soon as the Davao escapees had hoped. The Tribune obtained the War Department's permission to tell Dias' story in the fall of 1943. Mysteriously, the government withdrew the permission and forbade Dias from divulging any further details of his prison camp experiences or escape. The whole purpose of our escape seemed thwarted, mocked every day, said San Gracio, Dias' fellow squadron mate and best friend. One by one, those members of the escape party to make it back to the United States were summoned to the Pentagon for top-secret debriefings with intelligence personnel and other government bureaucrats. Pencil-pushing officers who would probably faint if they smelled gunpowder, as Dias' father would later say. These individuals hoped to suppress the story as ordered by the powers that be in Washington. These men were reminded of their oaths of loyalty they had taken as commissioned officers and were threatened with court-martials. Finally, after a 4-month battle, one lengthened by official reluctance, institutional secrecy, bureaucratic indecision, Dias' story was finally released to a stunned American public in January 1944. Bewildered Americans collectively shook their fists at Japan and demanded Congress strengthen U.S. forces in the Pacific. The only way to answer the Japs for these claims is with more planes and tanks and guns for General MacArthur, quipped one senator. Other politicians and high-ranking officials demanded that the Navy be immediately dispatched for an all-out battle with Japan, and that the Army Air Force gut Japan's heart with fire. The government made more disclosures about what had taken place in the Philippines. Through diplomatic channels, Secretary of State Cordell Hull issued a warning to Japan that those responsible for war crimes would be made to be paid in full after the war. The most important effect, however, of this story and the resulting revelation was the effect of this revelation on the home front, in places like Maywood. American workers within sight of War Department posters depicting forlorn prisoners of war, saying with the words, "Remember me, I was on Bataan," smashed previous output records. Complacency was wiped out, and the country was renewed in its focus to defeat its enemies. The story was also employed to aid the sale of war bonds during the Fourth War Loan drive. The outrage created by the Davao escapees' revelations ultimately helped strengthen the war effort, serving, as one prominent newspaper columnist would put it, as a second Pearl Harbor. It proved to be a real turning point in the war, one that helped galvanize the American public and military for a renewed prosecution of the war. But the famous battles of Midway and Guadalcanal were successful in stopping Japan militarily in the Pacific. The battle to release the Davao escapees story and the story of Bataan was an incredibly important home front, pivotal victory, one that undoubtedly stoked home front fires and incinerated the little-known mid-war complacency. That the Dias story stirred the nation more deeply than any event since Pearl Harbor, there can be little doubt, quotes Chicago Tribune reporter Charles Levell. The testimony of the POWs had been received exactly as Dias thought it would. It swept the nation, infuriated the American public, alerted the world to the horrific story of the Bataan Death March and atrocities committed by the Japanese. It ultimately shamed the Japanese into at least providing some semblance of humane treatment to the Allied prisoners in their charge. All this was made possible because one small group of men, not a regiment of soldiers or Marines, not a flight of B-29 bombers, not an armored division, nor a fleet of ships, for that matter, just 12 men, 12 very human beings, won a little-known battle against not only their captors, but their own government to tell a story. Today, 66 years later, the story of that sacrifice and suffering, of valor and service, the story that these special men daringly risked their lives and careers to tell, still needs to be told. Sadly, but inevitably, the day is going to come when there are those who were there will not be around to tell that story. And so it falls to us, historians and writers such as myself, widows, children, and other relatives, neighbors, friends. Now, judging by the amount of brass here, and I don't really have enough rank to give you guys an order, so we'll make it a challenge. I think it's our responsibility to tell this story, to carry on the work that those first escapees started in April of 1943, when they first got the news and brought it out with them. And all the survivors who were fortunate enough to come home continued to carry on that story for the remainder of their lives, and for the better part of the last 65 years. It's a job that's done every September here in Maywood. but must be replicated, not necessarily in a large-scale event, but on an individual personal scale, in other Maywoods, in other schools, other parks, other households around the country. We all must become storytellers so that future generations will know of places called Bataan, Davao, Maywood, and of the men whose names will forever be inextricably linked to those places, and so that their story will never be forgotten or come to an end.